Morning. Today's quite a fun daf, like many of them are. I don't want to single anyone out. So let us get straight to it. The second part is where it gets really complicated. So let's get started on the first part, which is a continuation from yesterday, and then I'll give a little introduction when we get to the very complicated part. So says the Gemara today on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph 75 in Masechet Sanhedrin. Last night, we were discussing the rules of Yaharog ve'al Yavor, right? When you get killed, as opposed to being over an Avera, and when you don't, when you're over ve'al Tarog. And we said different rules. One is that there are three main ones. It depends on public or private. It depends on Shat Gzeira or Shat Shmad. It depends on the motivation of the person asking you to do it, right? If it's doing it for their own Hana'ah, according to Rava, it's different. So we had all these details. And again, as I mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of discussion in Halacha about this because, unfortunately, of how many practical questions came up about this question. So grateful that we don't have that today, at least in America. Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav. Says Rav Yehuda Amarav at the top of Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph, second line. There was once a story that will illustrate some of these halachot. Ma'aseh ba'adam echad. There was a person once, shenatan einav bishachat. He put his eyes to desire to sleep with a woman. For whatever reason, we don't know why these things happen. He saw her, he decided that he needed to sleep with her, and he physically felt, and he got sick because it wasn't possible. Either she was usher to him, she was married, we'll see. The hello libo tina, and his tina's desire, some say passion, rose in his heart, meaning he was lovesick for her physically. So they came and asked the doctors, and the doctor said, Amru, we have no medical result for this. We can't give him any medicine or any treatment that will get this desire out of him unless he sleeps with her. Otherwise, he is going to die. Amru Chachamim, the rabbi said, Yamut, he should die. Ba'al tiba ello, right? He shouldn't sleep with her. It's not a patur to sleep with someone who's prohibited to him because he's going to get sick otherwise, because he is sick or die. You have to allow yourself to die in this crazy circumstance and not sleep with her. So then the doctor said, well, maybe it would be enough if he just saw her. Maybe that would be enough for him to not have this sort of desire and maybe get better again. So Tamod lifanav aruma, let her stand in front of him naked, so that he whatever that might help his desire. The rabbi said, nope. Yamut, he should die. Now, of course, that is not a prohibition of the Torah, right? To look at someone inappropriately, it might lead to things, etc. But it's not Nisr Dora, Isser of Nita or anything. But still, they said, because basically, let's keep going. But let's keep going. Then we'll explain some of the reasons. So I don't want to speak it all out. But that was the case. They said that he cannot even do that. So they said, well, maybe if she just talks to him, he doesn't even need to see her. Let her have an anonymous, chat with him, or let her speak to him from behind the fence. And the Chachamim said, she should rather die than have her have to come speak to him. So now says the Gemara, what was the case? Rabbi Yaakov bar Idi and Shmuel bar Nachmani, two Amoraim, disagreed about this situation. Chad Amar, Eshet Dishaita. Right? One said she was a married woman, and therefore the whole thing to begin with was an Isser Doraita, and then everything else was leading to it. As Abizrayo was leading to it, and that's why they wouldn't let him do this in order to save his life. But the other one said, Chanamar Pinuyaita. The other one said she wasn't even married. She couldn't, in theory, have slept with him. So I understand if you say she was married, so of course he can't sleep with a married woman. So Shaper, I understand the whole stepping away from the sexual interaction and even levels away from it. I get that. If she's a pniya, what's the big deal? It's literally what Michael Yai means, right? Meaning, why don't we sure, it's not fair to her and it's not right, but why would we allow him and say he has to be killed if she doesn't necessarily want to sleep with him? We don't force her to do it. So Rav Papa says, well, it's mishum pegam mishpacha. The reason is that it would damage her. Right? He can buy her out, pay her money. She can acquiesce to doing it, but we won't allow him to do it against her will because it will damage her. We say mishpacha means her too, meaning it's like she has a reputation that would be harmful, that she basically slept with this person just to save his life. That is a negative for her, and we can't force her to do it. And since we can't force her to do it, Rashi understands mishpacha means her, right? We can't force her to do it. We can't make her sleep with him. Again, he can offer a lot of money or do whatever he might do, but he can't be forced to do it. And it doesn't matter. You can't come to her and say, I'm going to die. That's his problem, so to speak. It is his problem. But that's one explanation. Ravika says, the whole point is that we don't want this to be something that's acceptable. We don't want Benot Yisrael to be prutzot barayot, to be open with sexual things. And, we don't play games, so to speak, with sexual things. And if she, outside of marriage, when he wants to sleep with her, we would not allow him to do it, even if it meant his life was going to be lost. Says, well, okay, but why doesn't he just marry her? So, I mean, outside of marriage, I get it, but Minsav, let him marry her. Says, well, no, that's ridiculous. No, of course, the question is, what when you let him marry? Is she interested in marrying him? Is she not? Right? So Rashi seems to imply like we would sort of force her to marry him because to save his life, meaning the whole thing is we wouldn't force her to sleep with him to save his life because Benot Yisrael would be prutzot barayot. But potentially, if it was going to be married, there wouldn't be prutzot barayot, because then you would say it's only a circumstance where it's permitted. So why don't we sort of, it doesn't Russian say the word force, but why don't we sort of make her marry him? Says the Gemara, well, that wouldn't have helped. The doctor said, lo mityatva miyatva date, that would not calm his mind, because his desire was the illicit relationship. He saw her, had this desire, got mentally and physically sick because of it, but it wouldn't help if he could have her legally. Rav Yitzchak said, from the day the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, and the Yetzer Hara, as we had earlier, remember, the Yetzer Hara was reduced, nitla tam bi'ah, the most passionate, desired intercourse was taken from regular association. Was given over to those who sin. Mayim genuvim yimtaku, stolen waters are sweet. Lechem sitarim yiraim, and hidden or illicit bread is what fills someone up. So basically, this guy, it would not have worked, right? If he had married her and slept with her, he would still be sick. So he needed to have an illicit relationship with her. And even though she was a pnuya, the rabbi said, that is not, we would not allow and would discourage it, and he should die over sleeping with her. Hadr ben Moreh, that is the end of that parak. Again, it leaves open all kinds of questions about how you apply these things, and very important, but not our issue today. Continues the Gemara now in the middle of Daf Ayin Hey and Aleph to the next punishment of Beit Din, which is Sreifa. Now, Sreifa is very interesting, and it's not very common, right? So let's read the Mishnah. I'm going to read the first few words, and then I'm going to pause. It says the Mishnah, Elohin HaNisrafim, the following people are the ones who get Sreifa, or burned. And we said earlier, the Misa of Sreifa was where they would pour hot or boiling molten lead down someone's throat and thus kill them. So who gets Sreifa? Habal Isha Ubita. A woman who sleeps with a man, who sleeps with a woman, an Isha, and her daughter. So two relationships, two relatives, meaning sequential. And that's case one. We'll get back to that in 1 second. And the second case, the very, very, very famous case, is Bat Kohen Shezinta, right? We discussed all these many times. The daughter of a Kohen who's Mizaneh, remember a regular woman who is Mizaneh, if she's a Na'ara, she gets Skila. If she's not a Na'ara, she gets Chenek. But a Bat Kohen has a specific halacha that she gets Sreifa. And we had a big discussion earlier. Does that mean Sreifa is worse? Does it mean that it's only a Arusa and not a Nesua? Anyways, all that we discussed. Now let's get back, though, to our first case, a woman and her daughter. So I'm going to tell you, I hope this is clear. This is very complicated. I'll start with that introduction. And one can learn this, 20 times, probably done that or more, and still be a little confused. But the Torah itself has 3 different psukim that talk about sleeping with a woman and her relatives. And they refer to 3 different, I would say, categories of cases. I'm going to read them very quickly, if that's okay, though it's very quick. And we're going to come back to them over and over today. So try your best to catch these. Starting in Perek Achrimot. Remember, in Achrimot, we talk mostly about don't do something. And in Kedoshim, we mostly say if you do it, you get this punishment. Okay? So there's 3 different psukim, 2 in Achrimot and 1 in Kedoshim. The first pasuk in Achrimot is Perek Yudchet, pasuk Zayin, where it says, nope, that's the wrong one. Pasuk Yud, Yudchet Yud. It says, Ervat bat bincha ubat bitcha lo tegale. Don't sleep with your daughter's daughter, your granddaughter, or your son's daughter, your granddaughter through your son or through your daughter. Lo tegale ervatan ki ervatcha hina. Well, this word Hena is going to be super important. They are ervot to you. So that is your daughter. Well, no, it doesn't say your daughter. It says your granddaughter from your son or your daughter. Okay, we're going to learn in a second that includes also your daughter. So a man's descendants. Okay. Now, the mother is not part of this picture here because it could be that he wasn't married to the mother, right? He slept with a woman, had a daughter, and that daughter had grandchildren. You can't sleep with those daughter or grandchildren. That's one pasuk. It doesn't say anything about punishment. It just says you can't do it. Then a few pasukim later in pasuk Yud Chet, nope, kept doing it wrong. In pasuk Yud Zayin, it says Ervat Isha Ubita Lo Tigaleh. Don't sleep with a woman and her daughter. Right now, this of course implies even if it's not your daughter, let's say you marry a woman, she had a daughter from previous marriage, you can't sleep with that daughter. So a woman's daughter, not your daughter, but a woman's daughter, your wife's daughter. And then it continues, says, as Bat Binav et Bat Bita, her daughter's daughter and her son's daughter, so granddaughter, Lo Tikach Legalot Ervata. Then it adds these words, Sheira Hena, it's your relative, Zimahi. It's Zima. This is whatever that means. Okay. So those psukim are a man's grandchildren and his wife's daughter and grandchildren. And then the third case in Kiddushim is now in Perek Chaf, sorry. I'm going to find it one day. Maybe I won't find it. Sorry, give me 1 second. Oh, there we go. Let's turn the page, I think. It's Perek Chaf, Pasuk. I don't know. Can't find it. Give me 1 second. It's really, really important. Even though I can't find it. There we go. Pasuk Yud Dalet. Paragraph Pasuk Yud Dalet. It says, Ish asher yikach et isha, a man who sleeps with a woman, ve'et ima, and her mother. So now instead of her daughter, it goes up to her mother. Zimahi. That word zima, which we saw before. And then it says, be'esh yisrufu. You should burn him. Oto, him, ve'et hen, and them. And this is a real big question. What does them mean? And then it continues, it says, Lo tiye zima betochechem. So basically, we have three categories, just to repeat it again. A man's grandchildren, which we're going to in a second include his daughter as well. So his daughter, granddaughter from son and daughter, 3 people. His wife's daughter and grandchildren, 3 people. And his wife's mother, and we're going to learn in the Gemara in a minute, also his wife's grandmother, which we doesn't say in the pasuk. What's very interesting, I'll just point this out, is that it doesn't say anything about a man's mother and grandmother, right? So what about the fourth group, right? His mother and grandmother. So we know that it says elsewhere in different pasuk that a person can't sleep with his mother. That's an isser, but it's not an isser of sreifa. It's an isser of skila. A person's grandmother, very fascinatingly, is not usher to him at all. So there is no prohibition in the Torah with a man sleeping with his grandmother, right? His father's mother. His wife's mother is a whole different question. It's his mother-in-law. But there is no prohibition in the Torah about a man sleeping with his grandmother. We discussed this in Yevamot in detail, and everybody agrees that some say it is prohibited, but let's say it's not, that it's an Isser Shniot Midivrei Sofrim, that it is prohibited, but it's not included in this category. So we're going to discuss what I just told you as a summary of the rest of today's daf. Okay? So let us now read that in the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah, Yesh Bichlal Isha Bita. When the Torah or when the Mishnah talks about a woman and her daughter, meaning 2 generations that you're not allowed to sleep with, that refers to 9 different people. It refers to Bito, a wife's daughter. Again, it does not have to be a man's daughter. It could be a wife's daughter from previous marriage. Ubat Bito, Ubat Bino, right? Her granddaughter from the son or daughter. We always count them separately. It also includes, sorry, Bito is his daughter. I take it back. First case is his daughter, his granddaughter from his son or daughter. The second case is Bat Ishto, the daughter from his wife, again, not necessarily his daughter, and grandchildren, Bat Bito, Bat Bina, granddaughters. And Chamuto includes going up now. His mother-in-law, Aim Chamuto Aim Chamif, and his mother-in-law's mother, or his father-in-law's mother. So there are 9 people who, if a person sleeps with, he's chayiv sreifa, and they're chayiv too, right? Sreifa for this prohibition of isha ubita, which obviously does not just mean a woman and her daughter. It means a person and a relationship either 1 or 2 degrees away from them. So the wife is, let's say, first generation, the mother is second, the grandmother is third, daughter is second, granddaughter is third. Now, says the Gemara.
Steinsaltz has a nice diagram.
Okay, well, I don't have it, but I think hopefully I got it all outside, but if anyone can look inside, it would be very helpful because this is obviously confusing, and I'll probably misspeak somewhere along the way. So correct me if you hear something that doesn't make any sense. Says the Gemara now. First of all, the Mishnah itself doesn't make a ton of sense because remember I just quoted you 3 psukim, and the only one that says sreifa is a man who sleeps with his wife and her mother, not his wife and her daughter. So Habal Isha Shenasabita Lo Katani. The Mishnah does not say that case. A person sleeps with a woman who he had married her daughter, meaning his mother-in-law. It doesn't say that. Ella, it says a man who sleeps with a woman and her daughter. Habal Isha Ubita. That implies that it's not that he married a woman and then slept with a prohibited person, meaning her mother, but he slept with 2 prohibited people, a woman and her daughter, right? Meaning they're both usher. That neither one of them is permitted. Umaninu is referring to in our Mishnah is chamoto ve'im chamoto. Our Mishnah is referring to a person slept with he's married to a woman, slept with her mother and her grandmother, and both are prohibited. He can't sleep with her mother, he can't sleep with her grandmother. So that's what our Mishnah is referring to. The Ketani, now the reference for that would be, I read the pasuk to you where it says otov eten, right? Her and them. So it says in the pasuk only don't sleep with the white woman and her mother, but then it says eten, and we're going to maybe learn from there. We're going to get into this, the mother's mother. Now, Ketani, then the Mishnah continues and says, Yesh bechlal isha bita, that included in the pasuk of isha and bita are all these other people. Michlal the tervav tiva bahadya, implying that the isha bita we're referring to in our Mishnah, which we think means a mother-in-law and a grandmother-in-law, are both written in the pasuk, and we're adding more people from them. But the problem is that a grandmother, as we said, is not written anywhere. Hanach midrasha atya. A grandmother is derived from a drasha, which we'll get to later today. But it only says a mother-in-law. It doesn't say anything about a grandmother-in-law. So it says, well, this would make sense going to Abaye. The Amar is going to say, and we're going to have this tomorrow, that mashmaut darshin ikabeinayu. It's a big machloka we're going to have later between Rabbi Akiva and others. Then the machloka between them is mashmaut darshim. Then, and Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that in fact the pasuk of eten includes a grandmother. And matinita mani Rabbi Akiva. And so the Rabbi Akiva is the Tan of our Mishnah, which is fine, right? Rabbi Akiva is the Tan of our Mishnah. Ella, the Rava, the Amar, Rava is going to say later, again, we'll have this machloket tomorrow, that the difference between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, the machloket later, is chamoto la'achar mita ikabeinayu. It's not a question of a woman and her mother, which is your mother-in-law, and whether the pasuk adds a grandmother-in-law. The question is, let's say a wife dies, is her mother-in-law still prohibited? And the pasuk of Atan is there to include that, yes, that in fact, according to Rabbi Akiva, mother-in-law is still included, even though the wife is no longer alive. But if that's the case, matita money. There's nobody in our Mishnah, no Tana who would say that a grandmother-in-law is prohibited from the pasuk. It's from a drasha, which we'll get to, but not from a pasuk. So then how does our Mishnah say that you're talking about sleeping with a mother-in-law and a grandmother-in-law, and included in those who are written in the pasuk is many others. They're not written in the pasuk. Amar lecha Rava, so Rava would have to explain our Mishnah to say that you're right. We have to change the words in our Mishnah. Tani, you should instead read our Mishnah, Haba al Isha, you slept with a woman who is your mother-in-law. Shenasa bita, you had previously married her daughter. So that's what our Mishnah is referring to. A man slept with his mother-in-law. And then the Mishnah continues and says, right, included in that prohibition, which is from the Torah, are 9 others, or not 9 others, but 9 total, 8 others. Says the Gemara, now let's read that inside. Then Yesh Bechlal Isha Bita. So the Mishnah continues and said, included in that prohibition of a woman and her daughter, which again, according to Abaya means a mother-in-law and a grandmother-in-law, and according to Rafa means a mother-in-law and a daughter, right? Or just a mother-in-law because the daughter was permitted. Then included in that prohibition is the following 9, and 3 of them were Chamoto, Im Chamoto, Im Chamiv, right? A mother-in-law, a grandmother-in-law from the father, a grandmother-in-law from the mother. Now, according to everybody, some of these have already been mentioned. L'abaya, 2 of them are already mentioned, a mother-in-law and her mother. But I did the Kabbalah Mitzvah Im Chamiyah, but because we have to add the 3rd case, which is a father-in-law's mother, then we also say the group. The group is mother, grandmother, grandmother, right? Tni Chamoto ve'im Chamoto. According to Rava, only one of them has been mentioned, because the only one we've mentioned is mother-in-law. We didn't mention grandmother-in-law from either father or mother's side. So I did the Kabbalah Mitzvah Im Chamiv ve'im Chamoto, since we still have to mention those 2 cases, grandmother from a father, meaning a father-in-law's mother or a mother-in-law's mother. Tninami chamoto. So we also throw in again, even though we already said it, a mother-in-law. So we're not really adding 9 cases. We're adding either 7 cases according to Abaya, because we already said mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law, and 8 cases according to Rava. Okay, so that is the Mishnah. now we get to the very, very complex Minahani Mili. Okay, how do we know this? We are, I think I count around 10 lines from the bottom, just in the middle of the line, around halfway through these wide lines. How do we know these psukim? I read to you, again, 3 sets of psukim. One which says a man should not sleep with his granddaughter from his son or his daughter. It doesn't say anything about his daughter. A second group which says a man should not sleep with his wife's daughter, granddaughter from son or daughter. It says 3 people, and it uses the word zima there. Okay. Neither one says what happens if you do it. There's no onesh. The third pasuk, set of psukim, which is one pasuk, was an onesh in Kedoshim, which is a man should not sleep with his mother-in-law, and he gets sreifa if he does. Okay. How do we know all 9 of them, all of them get sreifa? Okay. So Minani Mili, Tana Rabbanan, we have a Braita which goes through the whole thing in incredibly complicated and cryptic language, which we will unpack for the rest of today's daf. It says now, this is the pasuk in Kedoshim, Ish asher yikach et isha ve'et ima. A man sleeps with a woman and her mother. Now, then, he should get sreifa. Says the Braita, Ein li ela isha ve'ima. Okay, I only know a man and his mother-in-law. Bat isha, ubat bito, bat bina. What about if he sleeps? Now, the Torah already said, don't sleep with a woman and her daughter and her granddaughter, but how do we know what the punishment is? Minayin. How do you know they also get sreifa? Well, says the Braita, because Nemer kan zima, because remember I read the psukim, there's a word zima in mother-in-law, but Nemer kan zima, Nemer halan zima, it says zima by wife's daughter. Mala halan, just like by there, bita, ubat bito, bat bina, it's referring to 3 groups. Again, none of this really makes any sense, right? It's referring to 3 groups of people, basically, meaning 3 people: a daughter, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter. Sorry, daughter and granddaughters, wife's daughter and granddaughters. Afkan here too. Bita, bat bina. Again, none of this really makes any sense because we just asked a question about a mother-in-law. I'm not really clear what we're talking about. So that's the first part of the Braita. Continues the Braita. How do you know that the men are like the women? Again, we don't exactly know what this means, but presumably, we're going to see in a second, it means a daughter from the man as same thing as a daughter from his wife, right? Because they're different categories. A man's daughter and granddaughters are prohibited, and his wife's daughters and granddaughters are prohibited, even if they're not his kids, right? So how do you know they're also included? Nemer kan zima. Well, it says the word zima, but nemer lahalan zima, and it says zima. No, of course, it doesn't say the word zima in his granddaughters, but we're going to ask that question. And therefore, Mala just like over there, we'll see what over there means. The men are like the women, the male descendants are like the female descendants. Afkan, okay. Here too, it's the same thing. Now, the third part of the Braita says, again, we're going to stop at the end of this and go through every word. But the third part of the Braita is, Minayan lasot lemata kilamala. How do you know to make those who are lower like those who are higher? We don't exactly know what that means. One explanation, which we're going to entertain, is that those who are below you, meaning a man's daughter and granddaughter, is the same as his mother, or not mother, mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law. How do you know to make those below him like those above him? Well, again, Nemer kan zima, Nemer lahan zima, it says zima and zima, mala halan, just like over there, lamata kilamala, those below are like those above, abkan lamata kilamala. And you go the other way, umakan, just like there, lamata lamala kilamata, the ones above are also like the ones below, afla halan lamala kilamata, so too over there, the ones above are like the ones below. And again, none of this really is clear on the surface what in the world we're talking about, and how from these 3 clauses in the Braita, we learn out 9 people get sreifa for a prohibited act. So let us now try to understand the whole Braita, okay? So the first part of the Braita is actually the one that makes the most sense. So I'm going to read it again in the Braita. It says, Ish asher yikach et isha et ima. I'm going backwards just to read it again. A man sleeps with a woman and her mother. So we said you only know a woman and her mother for sreifa. How do you know that the prohibitions in Achrimot of a woman's daughter and grandchildren also get sreifa? So we said the word zima and zima, which is true. That's easy, right? It says the word zima by a man marries a woman, her daughter and granddaughter. It says don't do it zimahi. And it says the word zima by a mother-in-law. Just like by a mother-in-law, it's sreifa. By a daughter or stepdaughter and step-grandchildren, it's sreifa. Okay? The second part of the Braita is what we try to now get to now. Amar Mar. Says the Gemara, we quote the Braita, right? That's how we always do it. We are 3 lines in the bottom. Okay? So the second part of the Braita said the following. Minayin lasot zcharim kinekevot. How do you know to make men like women? Now, what does that mean? My zcharim kinekevot. So presumably what it means, Ilema, what you would presume to say, bat binah, well, this is the first explanation, that if a man marries a woman, he's not allowed to then sleep with her daughter, and he can't sleep with her daughter's daughter. How do you know also that he can't sleep with her son's daughter? So you know that a granddaughter from a son is the same as a granddaughter from a daughter. Says Gemara, but that's Ilema bat binah, to tell you that the daughter of a son is also prohibited like a bat bita. The pasuk says both. It says bat bita, bat binah. Torah says that. It says them together. Ella, okay, I get it. So maybe you're going the other direction, you're going up and saying a man can't sleep with a woman and her mother, right? His mother-in-law. He also can't sleep with his mother-in-law's mother or his father-in-law's mother. So maybe the question is, how do you to make the father-in-law's mother as prohibited as the mother-in-law's mother? Ella, maybe the question is the last line, Im chamiv keim chamoto. The mother of his father-in-law is just as prohibited as the mother of his mother-in-law. There's more, but neither one is in the pasuk at all, right? Because Torah just says don't sleep with a mother-in-law, right? It doesn't say don't sleep with a mother-in-law's mother. We're going to learn it, but we don't. It doesn't say it in the pasuk. So Hashta says the Gemara, Ein mechamoto lo kamalan. We don't have any source yet. We haven't yet derived a prohibition of a mother-in-law, right? A grandmother-in-law. How are you going to ask? How do you know father-in-law's mother? Ein chamiv mehaderla. We're looking to find an ein chamiv. So that is the question. Doesn't make a lot of sense. Sorry, Ken, we're in the middle, but stop me if something is very unclear. Says Abaya, we're on Ayin Hey Amabet, the top line now. Amar Abaya Hachikamer. You know, this is what the Braita is saying. We're going to have to change some words in the Braita a little bit, but we have to clarify what's going on in the Braita, right? The Braita is saying the following. Minayin lasot she'er haba mimenu. How do you know that the she'er, the relatives that come from the man, meaning his daughter and his granddaughters, either his son's daughter or his daughter's daughter, are the same as his descendants or the descendants that come from his wife, who won't necessarily be his children from a previous marriage? They are kishe'er haba mimena. How do you know that the descendants from him are the same as for her? And the reason we're asking this question is twofold. One is, how do we know that they get sreifa, right? Breita said that you get sreifa by a wife's daughter and grandchildren because you compare the word zima from there to the word zima by mother-in-law. But it doesn't say the word zima by a man's daughter and granddaughter. So how do you know they also get sreifa? Torah says don't do it. How do you know they get punished with sreifa? So the Breita then answers, Nemar kan zima v'nemar lan zima. It's because again, it says the word zima by one, it says the word zima by the other. But that's false. How b'she'er didelo k'tiv be'zima. If you go back to the psukim, which we read in the beginning, by the man's relatives, the man's daughter and grandchildren, doesn't say daughter, but we're assuming it for a second, but his granddaughters, it doesn't say the word zima. It says the word she'era, heina, but it doesn't say the word zima. So how do you know? What do you mean, zima, zima? It doesn't say that. So Amar Rava says, Rava, this is the very famous statement of Amar li Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi told me that in fact it's a two-step limud. That it says the word Hena by a man's grandchildren. It says the word Hena by his wife's grandchildren. It says the word Zima by his wife's grandchildren. And it says the word Zima by his mother-in-law. So we do a two-step limud. We compare a man's grandchildren to his wife's grandchildren, not using the word Zima, using the word Hena. And then because a wife's grandchildren are sreifa because of the word Zima, we learn that from Zima, from a mother-in-law. So says Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, it's very simple. Atya Hena. First we learn Hena to compare a man's grandchildren to his wife's grandchildren. And then once we know that his grandchildren are like hers, then we learn Zima to compare her grandchildren to get sreifa, meaning his and hers, like mother-in-law. So we need to have basically a two-step limud in order to know that sreifa applies to a woman's grandchildren, daughter and grandchildren, and a man's grandchildren. Okay, so that is first answer. Now, Amar Mar, let's go to the next controversial part of the Braita, which is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines from the top. The Braita said the following: Minayin lasot, minayin lasot limata kilamala. How do you know to make those who are lower like those who are higher. Now, what does that mean, lower and higher? My limata kilamala. What does it mean, lower and higher? So one explanation might be lower is grandchildren and higher is children, right? Meaning those who are descendants are similar, second generation. I'm going to call it third, right? Well, second generation is the same as first generation. So ilema, if you're saying bat bina ubat bita, a woman's granddaughters, right? The daughter of her son and the daughter of her daughter are like her daughter. But again, the Torah says them together. The pasuk itself says them all together. And I'll read it again. It's been a little bit since I read it. It says, Ervat isha ubita lo tigala, woman and her daughter, et bat bina et bat bita lo tikach legalot ervata. And that's where we say, she'era hina zimahi. So by her descendants, it says both of them. Ella, you're right. What it's saying actually is, how do you know that a grandmother-in-law is the same as a mother-in-law? Aim chamiv, the aim chamoto, which, if you recall, is very, very important to learn because the Torah never says don't sleep with a woman and her grandmother. It says don't sleep with a woman and her mother. So how do you know that a grandmother is like a mother or a grandmother-in-law is like a mother-in-law? That is a good question, but you wouldn't say, how do you know lemata kilamala? Lemata means lower as higher. Here you're saying higher, which is grandmother, is like lower, which is mother or mother-in-law. So why would you say high lamata kilamala? Doesn't say, it makes sense to say those who are lower, meaning we think mean lower in generation, are like those who are higher. You would have said lemala kilamatahu. You should have said the opposite. Those who are higher are like those who are lower. Says, well, you're right. I take it back. It's a little mistake. You got to change the braita. It should say tni lemala kilamata. Okay, you're right. Let's go back. Let's change those words in the braita. The braita meant to say, or it did say, how do you know those who are higher, meaning a grandmother-in-law, is prohibited just like one who is lower, meaning a mother-in-law? Says, well, okay, so if that's how you change the braita, then I don't understand the answer of the braita. Ihachi, the answer of the braita now we're quoting, the last narrow line, is that nemerkan zima says in this circumstance, we think now that means by a mother-in-law, the word zima, which does, but nemer lahalan zima, and it says by a grandmother-in-law zima, and that's how you learn it out. This is where it doesn't ever say that a grandmother-in-law is prohibited. There's no prohibition to say the word zima. Mahashta inhilok tibi. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah don't sleep with them. You can't say the word zima dituk tibi. You can't say the word zima by them. It doesn't even say them. So that can't be what the Braita means. So says Abaya on the first wide line on Daf Ayin Hey Amabet. Amar Abaya Hachikamer. Okay, let me give you a whole explanation, said Abaya, of the Braita. What the Braita is saying is not a particular person, not a grandmother-in-law is like a mother-in-law or a granddaughter is like a daughter. What the Torah is saying is, what the Braita, is saying is minayin lasot shlosha darot limala kishlosha darot limata. How do you know that when, just like below, you can't sleep with a woman, her daughter, and her granddaughter, so we call it 3 generations, so too that when you go up, it also is 3 generations. It's a woman, her mother, your mother-in-law, and her mother and her grandmother. How do you know that her grandmother is prohibited, which it doesn't say in the Torah, but it does say in our Mishnah? So that's the question. Minayin lasot shlosha darot limala, 3 generations above, kishlosha darot limata, and that nemar limata zima, because by a woman and her daughters, it does say the word zima. The nemar limala zima, it says the word zima by a mother-in-law, just like mala mata shlosha darot, just like the one below is a daughter and granddaughters. Af lamala shlosha darot, it's a woman, her mother, and grandmother. Says the Gemara, and then we continue in the Braita. Uma ba'onesh, this is how Abai would read the Braita, just like with the punishment, meaning the Torah says the word sreifa, it only says it by mother-in-law. So meaning there you learn from up, which is mother-in-law, to down, which is daughter and granddaughter. Asa limata makes the lower people, the granddaughter and daughter, kilimala, like the mother-in-law. Af bazara, so too, the opposite, when you're saying don't do it, which it doesn't say don't sleep with the grandmother-in-law, we learn it from the daughter-in-law, or the daughter, sorry. Af bazara nami asalimala kilimata. So we basically learn them out from each other, and that's a great explanation in the Braita. Of course, what you have to do is you have to change the words in the Braita, right? To say, instead of saying lower is like higher, you have to say higher is like lower. Okay, so that is the only problem. You have to change the Braita. Rav Ashi says Okay, hopefully everyone's got that clear. Pretty complicated. Rav Ashi says, where am I? The first word on the fifth wide line. I don't actually think you have to change the Braita. Olam kidiktani. I agree with you, Abai. I mean, everyone agrees with the facts here. No one is disagreeing with any facts in our Gemara. But I don't think you need to change the Braita. Say it the way it is. And when the Braita says lower is like higher, right? Or sorry, lower, how do you learn lower is like higher? What it means, malamata, does not mean how do you learn that granddaughter is usher like grandmother-in-law, because that can't be correct. Torah never says grandmother-in-law. What lamata means is how do you know that second, or I'm going to call it third generation, meaning lamata be'isur, further away from the primary person. The primary person is the wife or the woman you slept with. That's number one. Children or mother are number two. Grandmother or granddaughter are number three. So how do you know to make the third level, meaning the grandmother or granddaughter, like the second level? Okay. Ima lamata bi'isur. Says the Gemara, okay, but if you're doing it that way, mahi aim imo asura, afu imo asura. I have a fundamental question. If you're saying from the Braita that everything is parallel, right? Meaning you go down three generations, and again by three meaning a wife, a daughter, and a granddaughter, and you go up three generations, a wife, a mother, and a grandmother. Why then, if a man's daughter and granddaughter are prohibited, and his wife's daughter and granddaughter are prohibited, why don't we have the same parallel when you go up? That his wife's mother and grandmother are prohibited, that's true. Why don't you say his mother and grandmother are prohibited? And that's not true. His mother's prohibited, imchahi, but his grandmother is not prohibited. A man's father's mother or a man's mother's mother is not an Isser Erva. So why don't you have the same parallel? If you're going up and down, why don't you equate everything? Ask the Gemara, if the Braita is correct that you're basically learning one out from the other, why don't you say, just like with a wife, her grandmother is Asur, Aim Imo Asura, Afhu, so to a man, his grandmother should be Asur, Aim Imo Asura. Why is a person's grandmother from his father or his mother not Asur? Just shocking, right? Amar Abai says Abai, well, the answer is separate. It's because Amar Kra Imchahi. The pasuk says the word imchahi, meaning a person can't sleep with his mother, only his mother, not his grandmother. You're only chayiv for your mother, you're not chayiv for your grandmother. And so it's a specific limud to exclude a man's grandmother. That's a biased answer. Rava says, well, I'll tell you a whole nother reason, right? Remember, Torah does not say don't sleep with a grandmother. It also does not say don't sleep with a grandmother-in-law. So we just learned out that just like a person can't sleep with his mother-in-law and he can't sleep with his daughter and great and granddaughter, the mother-in-law extends up to a second generation. So he can't sleep with his mother-in-law and his grandmother-in-law. So our question now is, he can't sleep with his mother. Why doesn't it go up a second generation? Says Rava, because if you think about it, it's not, Tosfos points out, it's not a Gzer Shava Mufna, meaning it's not an extra Gzer Shava where we could say, even if the logic doesn't hold up, we learn from the pasuk. So it has to hold up in logic. And the thing is, it's not going to hold up. And part of the reason it's not going to hold up is that a person's mother-in-law is Sreifa, like our Mishnah said. A grandmother-in-law is Sreifa. A mother is not Sreifa. Remember, a mother is Skila. So when you come now to include a mother's mother or a father's mother, what punishment are you going to give? If you're going to give Sreifa, it's going to be problematic because the mother gets Skila. If you're going to give Skila, it's problematic because you're learning it from something where you give Sreifa. So let me read that inside. I simplified what Rava said, but let's read it now inside. Rava says, well, Bein Lamanda Amar, Domina Mina. Whether you go according to the logic or the rule that you learn from something and you stay consistent with that thing, meaning if we learn that a grandmother is prohibited from a grandmother-in-law, then we have to give the same punishment as grandmother-in-law, right? That's one possibility, which would be Sreifa. Or Bein Lamanda Amar Domina Uki Batra. There's another opinion which we have, which is that you learn from there that it's prohibited. So just like a grandmother-in-law is prohibited, a grandmother is prohibited, but then you treat a grandmother like a mother. Meaning you go, Alki Batra means you go after its own place, which is a mother. Then, and you give skila. Either way, Lo'atia doesn't work either way. And let's speak them out. The Manda Amar, according to the one who says that the principle is do mina mina, that you would learn from something and consistently keep all the rules of that thing, right? So then what you would say is, where are we? Lamanda or domina mina, I am 8 lines in the bottom. According to the one who says you're domina mina, then you would say the following. Mahi, just like his mother, right? or her, sorry, he is his wife, right? Just like her, aim imo asura, her grandmother is prohibited to the man. So afhu, so to him, the husband, nami aim imo asura. So just like his grandmother from his wife is, which is a grandmother-in-law, is prohibited, so to his grandmother should be prohibited. But then you'd have to learn mina, according to this opinion, meaning be very consistent and say mahi b'sreifa, just like a grandmother-in-law gets sreifa, afu hunami b'sreifa. So too, a man who sleeps with his grandmother should get sreifa. Well, that's problematic because mandamri sreifa chamura. Now, remember, we did machloket. Is sreifa more strict than skila? If sreifa is more strict than skila than ikla mifrach, then that is an immediate problem, which is you sleep with your mother, you get skila. You get your grandmother, you get sreifa, which is worse. You can't get a worse punishment for a further away relative, right? Malihi, it's different when you talk about her, about a wife, she can ima b'sreifa. If he slept with his wife's mother-in-law, you get sreifa, and therefore his grandmother-in-law gets sreifa. But tomar bahushi mo b'skila, you can't make a parallel to a man whose mother he gets skila for, right? So that's one question. The Oda, and the second question is, it doesn't make any sense to say that imo b'skila, amy mo b'sreifa. It doesn't make any sense that the relationship doesn't make any, right? That a mother who's closer to him gets skila, a grandmother who's further away gets sreifa if sreifa is more chamer. The ode, and another question, again, some of these will not be a question if you say skila is more chamer. But a third question is that you could also say that it doesn't hold up logically or structurally. Because mahi, just like a wife, lo chilakta ba bein ima le'im, the Torah did not differentiate between a man who sleeps with a woman, her mother, his mother-in-law, and her grandmother. So they all get sreifa. Afhu, so too, you would say the parallel should be the same by the man. Nami lo tachloko bein imo le'in imo. That there should be no difference between a mother, which is sreif skila, and a grandmother. But now you're saying the grandmother gets sreifa. So therefore, it doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, if you say leman the amar skila chamura, if you say skila is chamura, so the first two questions are not a problem. But mehai kushilon dunya, but you're not saved from this third question, right? The third one. So that's a problem if you hold don mina umina, meaning you learn a grandmother from a grandmother-in-law, and because you learn it from them, you get the same punishment, which is sreifa. Ulaman damar, but if you go the other way, and this is another way that we often learn in the Torah, in the Gemara, which is 3 lines in the bottom, that you're don mina uki batra. You learn from something, but then you apply the details like the source, like the destination, like the case where it's supposed to be brought. Meaning, you learn, oh, wife's grandmother is prohibited, so man's grandmother is prohibited. What's the punishment for a man's grandmother? Not the same as a wife's grandmother. It's the same punishment as his mother, right? So you basically say 3 generations on one side, 3 generations on the other side, but the punishments are different. So then dom mina v'uki batra, which would mean mahi, you would say just like a wife. You can't sleep with the mother of a wife or the mother or the grandmother, Amy Asura, her mother's mother is prohibited. Afunami, Amy Asura, so to a man, his grandmother is prohibited. But then Uki Batra, the punishment goes after his own relatives. Hatam hu de bisrefa. By a grandmother-in-law, you'd get sreifa, avahacha beskila, kedashkam beimo. Just like his mother, he should get skila. Well, if that's the case, well, then again, it depends on whether you hold sreifa or skila is more chamer. The mandamar sreifa chamura, if you're of the opinion that sreifa is stricter than ikla mifrach, you can always say, 1 second, you can't learn out a grandmother from a grandmother-in-law because malihi, a wife's relatives are more strict. Turn the page, right? Does ayin vav, shekin imo b'sreifa. A wife's mother is sreifa, a man's mother is skila. If sreifa is more chamer, it means that a wife's relationships are worse or harsher than his. Tomar behu, you can't say by him, she'ima b'skila, he only gets skila for sleeping with his mother. But and furthermore, like we said before, hu kihi, she should be like him, right? He should be like her. Mahi, just like by a wife, lo chalakta ba bein pita la'imima, there's no difference between a wife's daughter and a wife's grandmother, right? Or any of these relationships, meaning that if a man sleeps with his wife's daughter or granddaughter, or his wife's mother or grandmother, he gets sreifa for all of them. So Afu, you should say by a man, lo tachloko ben bito le'imimo. There should be no difference between his daughter and his grandmother, because we're learning all that from the same source. Now, the source of daughter is that isha ubita, which is sreifa. The source of grandmother, now you're saying, is a grandmother's like a mother, which gets skila. So it doesn't add up. And, says the Gemara, Laman damar skila chamura, mahakushalon dunya. According to the opinion that skila is chamer, the first question is not a problem, but the second one is a problem. And so therefore, basically, I think we have to stop here because it's the end of the daf. But basically, either way, which is the middle, unfortunately, of a sugya, but basically, either way, whether you learn that would learn a grandmother from a grandmother-in-law and apply the same punishment of a grandmother-in-law of sreifa, or you would apply the punishment of a grandmother gets the punishment of a mother, which is skila. Either way, you can't learn one out from the other. And as I said, it's because the Gzera Shava is not a very strong Gzera Shava. It's not mufna. So you can't say, oh, that's what the Torah is telling you. The Torah has to, it has to make sense without a question. You can lemifrach, you can ask a contradiction. And so far, we've had contradictions on this whole problem. And therefore, as of right now, and this is actually the halacha, there is no source that a man's grandmother from either his father or his mother would be prohibited from sexual relations. Of course, there is an Isser D'Rabbanan of Shniot, but not from the Torah, and certainly not a punishment of Sreifa or Skila. Now, tomorrow we're going to continue this discussion because unfortunately, even though the daf ends, the sugya is smack in the middle of other relationships. And the next one we're going to get to is called kalotcha, which is a person's daughter-in-law, meaning a son's wife. And we're going to see what relationship that person would have. Is that like a daughter? Or is it like anyways, we're going to discuss that all tomorrow. So we will stop here. I encourage everyone to review this because it's not so simple. Interesting, the psukim are very vague about all of this, and that's why, of course, it's so complex.
It seems like Chazal was having as much trouble with this as we are.
Sorry, who was?
Chazal seems to be having as much trouble with this as we are.
No, the psukim are just very, there's like minimal details and they're sort of random, right? It says in Kedoshim, it says nothing about a woman and her daughter or his daughter. And in Achrimot, it says nothing about a mother-in-law, right? So we basically have to piece it all together. And the key is the word zima, right? The word zima is extra and it says zima, zima. And so that is where we started, but let's continue tomorrow.
Seems like you're applying a different definition for mufna when you're stating it depends on logic. The traditional definition, which we learned over the years, is if a Gezerah Shava is mufna, it means there's something extra to be learned from it. That there's
no, it's not mufna. Mufna means that it's extra in the verse, that it doesn't
That's
need
right. It's extra. That's an extra. The verse makes it. There's an extra point in the verse. You can learn something extra from it.
No. Again, no. I mean, maybe we're saying the same thing. Mufna means that the verse is not necessary. It doesn't need
not necessary.
Right. So when a verse is not necessary, then we basically say, oh, this is a whole new pasuk. It can tell you much more than if a verse is necessary, but it still is similar. Right. So you could do a Gzera Shava it says the word zima, and it says the word zima. If the word zima is necessary, but it still is an unusual word to use, we can make a Gzera Shava from it. But if you make a Gzera Shava from it and it's not mufna, then you have to have internal logic in the Gzera Shava. When a Gzera Shava is completely mufna, meaning, or mishnei tzadim, let's say, mufna, both sides, the word zima, let's just say, is extra, then whatever we learn from it, you can't ask questions. We can learn the craziest thing from it. You can't say, oh, the logic doesn't hold up. The logic doesn't need to hold up. But when a Gzera Shava is not mufna, or not mufna mishnei tzadim, as Tosfos puts it, then you can start asking all the questions that we're asking in our Gemara.
Then it's not mufna in that case.
Correct. The Gzera Shava is not mufna, but we learn a lot from it, or we potentially learn a lot from it.
Right, but if it's mufna, it's not necessary. It's extra. So then you have an extra limit. You can learn from it.
You can learn from it.
If it is mufna,
you're always learning from Gzera Shava. The question is, can you learn things that are not logical, right? And if it's mufna, you can learn things that are illogical, that go against logic. Now, how do you know to learn that? Well, that's always a different question. You have to have a sort of a lima. You have to have a tradition, a Kabbalah. That's what you're supposed to learn from the Gzera Shava. Okay.
I don't know for some.
Have a good day, everybody. Continue tomorrow. I hope, again, I would encourage you to review because it's in the middle and it's going to be continued for tomorrow's stuff. Take care, everyone.